Thomas Harrington had always believed in the power of routine. At 58, he found comfort in the predictable rhythm of his days. Morning coffee with the newspaper, the familiar drive to his architectural firm, evening walks with his wife Eleanor around their neighborhood in the fading light of dusk. After 32 years of marriage, he and Ellie had settled into a comfortable pattern, like two dancers who knew each other's steps by heart. Their modest two-story colonial in the suburbs of Portland had witnessed the raising of their two children, now grown and building lives of their own. Michael, their eldest at 30, had followed his father's footsteps into architecture and lived across town with his wife and young daughter. Their daughter Sarah, 27, had moved to Chicago 3 years ago to pursue her career in publishing. The house felt different now, quieter, more spacious. Thomas sometimes missed the chaos of their children's teenage years, the constant noise and movement that had filled their home. But he and Eleanor had adapted, finding new rhythms together as empty nesters. They traveled more, took cooking classes, joined a local wine club. Thomas had even started playing golf again, something he'd abandoned when the kids were young and time was scarce. On this particular Thursday evening in late September, Thomas arrived home earlier than usual. The autumn air carried a crisp edge that hinted at the coming winter. He pulled into the driveway, noticing Eleanor's car wasn't there yet. She'd mentioned a late meeting at the community college, where she taught English literature part-time. Inside, he loosened his tie and poured himself a glass of the Cabernet they'd opened the night before. The house was silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a wedding gift from Eleanor's parents all those years ago. Thomas settled into his favorite leather armchair in the study, a room lined with bookshelves and family photos, and opened his laptop to check his emails. That's when he noticed Eleanor had left her iPad on the side table. It wasn't like her to forget it. She usually carried it everywhere, using it for both work and leisure. The screen lit up when he moved it, revealing a notification from a messaging app he didn't recognize. Without thinking, he tapped on it. The message preview showed only a name, Robert, and the first few words, "Can't wait to see you tomorrow." Same place. Thomas felt a strange tightness in his chest. He told himself there was surely an innocent explanation. Robert could be a colleague, a student needing help, anyone really. But something about the wording, the secrecy implied in "same place," made his fingers hover over the screen. He hesitated, aware he was crossing a boundary. In all their years together, he'd never invaded Eleanor's privacy this way. Trust had been their foundation. But the message nagged at him, like a loose thread that, once pulled, might unravel everything. The conversation history between Eleanor and Robert stretched back 6 months. Thomas scrolled through, his hands growing clammy, as the exchanges became increasingly intimate. There were plans for meetings, references to hotel rooms, expressions of desire that made his stomach turn. "I've never felt this way before," Eleanor had written. "You make me feel alive again." Thomas felt as though he'd been struck. The words blurred on the screen as his eyes filled with tears. He blinked them away, forcing himself to continue reading, needing to know the full extent of the betrayal. There were photos, nothing explicit, but intimate nonetheless. Eleanor smiling in places he didn't recognize. Robert, a man perhaps 10 years younger than Thomas, with salt and pepper hair and the confident smile of someone who took what he wanted from life. The most recent messages confirmed plans for tomorrow, a meeting at a boutique hotel downtown, the same one they'd apparently been using for months. Thomas felt physically ill, setting the iPad down with shaking hands. He sat motionless, trying to process what he'd discovered. The woman in those messages wasn't the Eleanor he knew, or thought he knew. His wife of 32 years, the mother of his children, his best friend and confidant. The betrayal was so profound it felt like a physical wound. The sound of a car in the driveway jolted him back to reality. Eleanor was home. Thomas quickly returned the iPad to where he'd found it, his mind racing. Should he confront her immediately? Wait and gather more information? Follow her tomorrow? He heard the front door open. Eleanor's footsteps in the hallway, the rustle of her coat being hung up. "Tom? Are you home?" Her voice, so familiar and yet suddenly strange to him, called out. "In the study," he managed to reply, amazed at how normal his voice sounded when everything inside him was in chaos. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, smiling. She looked the same as always, her silver-streaked brown hair pulled back in a loose bun, reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, dressed in the burgundy blazer and black slacks she often wore for teaching. "You're home early," she said, crossing the room to kiss his cheek. "Everything okay at work?" Thomas nodded, unable to trust his voice. Up close, he searched her face for signs of the stranger he'd glimpsed in those messages, the woman capable of such deception. But all he saw was the familiar features he'd loved for decades. "Just finished up the Westbrook project sooner than expected," he said finally. "Thought I'd come home and start dinner. How was your meeting?" "Productive," Eleanor replied, slipping off her shoes. "The curriculum committee is finally agreeing to update the required reading list. Only took 3 years of lobbying." She chatted on about her day, and Thomas marveled at her ability to lie so effortlessly. Had she always been this way? Had he been blind all these years? Throughout dinner, he went through the motions, responding when appropriate, even laughing at her anecdotes about difficult faculty members. But inside, he was calculating, planning. Tomorrow, he decided, he would see for himself. He needed to know everything before confronting her. That night, lying beside Eleanor in their bed, Thomas stared at the ceiling, listening to her steady breathing. Sleep was impossible. The woman next to him, whose body he knew as well as his own, had become a stranger. Every memory they'd shared now called into question. Every moment of intimacy, tainted by doubt. Morning came after a sleepless night. Thomas went through his usual routine: shower, shave, breakfast, while Eleanor prepared for what she claimed was a full day of classes followed by student conferences. "Don't wait up tonight," she said, kissing him goodbye at the door. "These conferences always run late, and then I promised to have dinner with Diane afterward." Another lie. Diane was her closest friend, and Thomas wondered if she was complicit in the deception, or just another person Eleanor was lying to. After Eleanor left, Thomas called his assistant at the firm and explained he wouldn't be coming in due to a personal matter. Then he waited an hour before driving downtown to the hotel mentioned in the messages. The Riverview Hotel was an upscale boutique establishment overlooking the river. Thomas parked across the street in a public garage that offered a clear view of the entrance. He felt ridiculous, like a character in some tawdry detective novel, but he needed to see with his own eyes. At 11:30, exactly as planned in their messages, Eleanor's car pulled into the hotel's small parking lot. Thomas watched as she stepped out, checking her appearance in the car window before heading inside. She looked nervous but excited, smoothing her hair and adjusting her clothing. 20 minutes later, another car arrived. The man who emerged matched the photos Thomas had seen. Robert, tall and confident, carrying what looked like a small gift bag. Thomas felt a surge of rage, so intense his vision blurred momentarily. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, forcing himself to breathe deeply. For 3 hours, Thomas sat in his car, alternating between numbness and fury. When they finally emerged from the hotel, Eleanor was laughing at something Robert said, her hand resting intimately on his arm. They kissed briefly before parting ways, each returning to their separate cars, their separate lives. Thomas followed Eleanor at a distance, watching as she drove not to the college as she'd claimed, but to a small cafe where she met Diane. So that part hadn't been a lie, just the timing. He wondered what version of her day Eleanor was sharing with her friend. Unable to watch anymore, Thomas drove home, his mind made up. The confrontation couldn't wait. Tonight, everything would change. Thomas spent the afternoon preparing. He transferred copies of the incriminating messages to his own computer. He reviewed their financial records, confirming his suspicion that Eleanor had been using their joint credit card for some of these hotel rendezvous. He even called their family attorney, scheduling an appointment for the following week, without specifying the reason. By the time Eleanor returned home at 9:30 p.m., Thomas had settled into a strange calm. The initial shock had given way to a cold, focused anger. Eleanor found him in the living room, sitting in the dark with only a single lamp illuminating the space. Her iPad sat on the coffee table between them. "Tom, why are you sitting in the dark?" she asked, setting down her purse. "Is everything okay?" "No, Ellie, everything is not okay." His voice was steady, controlled. "I think you should sit down." Something in his tone made her comply, without question. She perched on the edge of the sofa across from him, her expression wary. Eleanor's face drained of color. For a moment she seemed about to deny it, but then her shoulders slumped slightly. "Does it matter?" Thomas pushed the iPad toward her. "I saw your messages. And today, I saw you together at the Riverview. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, there were tears gathering. Tom, I can explain. Can you? Thomas interrupted, his voice rising despite his efforts to remain calm. Can you explain 6 months of lying to my face? Can you explain why you've been sharing our most intimate details with a stranger? Can you explain why, after 32 years, you couldn't just talk to me if you were unhappy? I wasn't unhappy, Eleanor said, a tear spilling down her cheek. That's what makes it so hard to explain. It wasn't about being unhappy with you. Then what was it about? Thomas demanded. Boredom? Excitement? Some midlife crisis I wasn't aware you were having? Eleanor wiped at her tears. It started innocently. Robert is a visiting professor from Seattle. We were assigned to the same curriculum committee. He was interested in my research, my ideas. We started having coffee after meetings to discuss literature, and somehow that led to hotel rooms? Thomas couldn't keep the bitterness from his voice. It evolved, Eleanor said quietly. He made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years, not just as a wife or mother or teacher, but as a woman with thoughts and desires of my own. And I didn't make you feel seen? Thomas stood up, unable to remain seated with the anger coursing through him. 32 years together, and you never felt seen by me? It's different, Eleanor insisted. With you, everything is comfortable, familiar. With Robert, it was new, exciting. I know it sounds cliché, but I felt young again. I wasn't throwing away our marriage. Eleanor stood too, her own anger flaring. I never intended to leave you. I love our life together. Just not enough to be faithful to it, Thomas shot back. Not enough to honor the vows we made. Do you even realize what you've done? How can I ever trust you again? I don't know, Thomas admitted. I've spent the day trying to figure that out. Part of me wants to throw you out. Part of me wants to call our children and tell them exactly what their mother has been doing. And part of me, his voice broke slightly, part of me is still trying to understand how the woman I've loved my entire adult life could do this to me. But you did, Thomas replied, and the worst part is, you kept doing it, day after day, lie after lie. It wasn't a mistake, Ellie. It was a choice. You chose him over me, over us, every time you met him. Eleanor sank back onto the sofa, burying her face in her hands. I'll end it, she said through her tears. I'll never see him again. We can go to counseling, work through this. Thomas looked at her, this woman he'd built a life with, and felt a profound weariness settle over him. I need time, he said finally. I can't make any decisions tonight, but I can't stay here either. I'm going to Michael's. Please don't tell the kids, Eleanor pleaded. Not yet. Let's figure this out first. Thomas picked up the small overnight bag he'd packed earlier. I won't tell them tonight, he promised. But I won't lie to them either, Ellie. Unlike you, I don't find that so easy to do. The drive to his son's house was a blur. Thomas found himself on Michael's doorstep, without any clear memory of the journey. It was nearly 11 when he rang the bell, and Michael answered in sweatpants and a t-shirt, confusion evident on his face. I'm sorry to show up like this, Thomas said, suddenly aware of how strange this must seem. I should have called first. It's fine, Michael assured him, ushering him inside. Is everything okay? Is Mom all right? The concern in his son's voice nearly undid Thomas. Your mother is fine, he managed. We're just having some issues. I needed some space tonight. I hope it's okay if I stay here. Michael exchanged a look with his wife Jenny, who had appeared in the hallway. Of course, he said. The guest room is all made up. Later, lying in his son's guest bed, Thomas stared at the ceiling much as he had the night before. But tonight, the numbness was giving way to a deep, aching pain. Everything he'd believed about his life, his marriage, had been upended. The future he'd envisioned, retirement with Eleanor, traveling, growing old together, now seemed like a naive fantasy. His phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. Please come home, we need to talk about this. Thomas turned the phone face down without replying. Tomorrow would be soon enough to decide what came next. The next few days passed in a fog of pain and practical decisions. Thomas returned home briefly to collect more of his belongings while Eleanor was at work. He left a note explaining he would be staying at a hotel for the time being and would contact her when he was ready to talk. At the firm, he threw himself into work, grateful for the distraction. His partners noticed the change in him, the dark circles under his eyes, the new terseness in his manner, but respected his privacy enough not to pry. On the third day, Thomas met with their family attorney, Richard Grayson, a man who had handled their wills and various legal matters for over 20 years. "Divorce?" Richard asked, clearly surprised. "Tom, are you sure about this? You and Eleanor always seem so solid." "I thought we were," Thomas replied grimly. "Things aren't always what they seem." "Eleanor has been having an affair," Thomas said, the words still difficult to say aloud. "For 6 months at least, maybe longer." Richard's expression softened with understanding. "I'm sorry, Tom, truly. But before we proceed with anything formal, I'd advise you to take some time. Decisions made in the heat of betrayal are often regretted later." "I'm not in the heat of anything," Thomas insisted. "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in months. I just want to understand my options." They spent an hour discussing the legal process, the division of assets, the potential timeline. Thomas listened attentively, taking notes, treating it like any other business meeting. It was only when Richard mentioned telling the children that his composure slipped. "Michael and Sarah will be devastated," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "This will change how they see their mother forever." "Children are resilient," Richard assured him. "And they're adults now, with their own relationships and understanding of how complicated life can be." Thomas nodded, but the thought of his children's pain added another layer to his own suffering. "Thomas, please don't hang up," she said when he answered. "I know you probably hate me right now, but I need you to know I didn't know about the affair until after you confronted Eleanor. She never told me." Diane sighed. "I knew she was excited about this new colleague, that they were spending time together discussing work. I thought it was just a professional friendship. Eleanor's always been passionate about literature, you know that. When she talked about him, it seemed innocent. Now I've told her she's making the biggest mistake of her life," Diane said firmly. "I've known you both for 25 years. What you have is real, Thomas. This thing with Robert is a fantasy, a midlife distraction. She's starting to realize that." "Is it?" Diane challenged. 32 years of marriage, thrown away without even trying to save it? That doesn't sound like the Thomas Harrington I know. After hanging up, Thomas sat in his hotel room, turning Diane's words over in his mind. Was he giving up too easily? Or was he simply acknowledging a truth that had been revealed to him, that the marriage he thought he had never really existed? The next day, Eleanor called. "The kids are asking questions," she said without preamble. "Michael knows something's wrong. He says you've been staying at a hotel, not at his house, like you told me." "I didn't want to put him in the middle," Thomas explained, "and I needed space to think." "We need to tell them something," Eleanor insisted. "Together. They deserve that much." Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision. "Fine," he agreed finally. "Sunday dinner. Ask them both to come." The days until Sunday stretched endlessly. Thomas alternated between anger, grief, and a strange detachment, as if he were watching someone else's life fall apart. He avoided Eleanor's calls and texts, needing the distance to maintain his resolve. On Sunday afternoon, he arrived at their home, no longer home in his mind, just the house, an hour before the children were due. Eleanor met him at the door, looking as though she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled. Thomas nodded curtly, moving past her into the house. It felt strange to be a visitor in the space he'd lived in for over 20 years. "I've ended things with Robert," Eleanor said, following him into the kitchen. "Completely. I told him I never want to see or speak to him again." "Good for you," Thomas replied, his tone neutral. "That doesn't change anything between us." "Doesn't it?" Eleanor asked, a hint of desperation in her voice. "I made a terrible mistake, Tom. The worst mistake of my life. But it doesn't erase 32 years together. It doesn't erase our family, our history." "No, it doesn't erase it," Thomas agreed, turning to face her. "It just changes how I see all of it. Every memory is different now, because I'm looking at it through the lens of knowing you were capable of this level of deception." "I'm beyond angry," Thomas interrupted. "I'm destroyed, Ellie. You were the one person I trusted completely. The foundation of my life. And you shattered that." How do we come back from that? Before Eleanor could respond, the doorbell rang. Michael and Sarah had arrived together, having driven in from the airport where Thomas had arranged for Sarah to be picked up. The next hour was excruciating. Sitting around the dining table where they'd shared countless family meals, Thomas and Eleanor broke the news that they were separating. They provided no details, simply stating that there had been a breach of trust that they were trying to work through. Sarah burst into tears immediately. "But you're Tom and Ellie," she sobbed. "You're the couple everyone wants to be. You can't just throw that away." Michael was quieter, his gaze moving between his parents with growing understanding. "This isn't a sudden decision," he observed. "Something specific happened." Thomas and Eleanor exchanged a look. "Yes," Thomas admitted. "Something happened that has forced us to reevaluate our marriage." "Dad found out Mom was cheating," Michael said bluntly, the pieces falling into place. "That's why you showed up at my house that night, isn't it?" The silence that followed was confirmation enough. Sarah's sobs grew louder, while Michael's expression hardened. Eleanor looked stricken. "I made a terrible mistake," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt any of you." The rest of the evening was tense and painful. Despite Thomas and Eleanor's attempts to assure their children that they would always be a family, that this wouldn't change their love for them, the damage was evident. The foundation of security their children had always known, their parents' solid marriage, had crumbled. After Michael and Sarah left, promising to call the next day, Thomas and Eleanor sat in silence at the empty table. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked, looking older and more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. In the weeks that followed, Thomas established a new routine. He found a small apartment to rent month to month, not ready to commit to anything more permanent. He worked longer hours at the firm, took up running again after years of neglecting exercise, and had weekly dinners with Michael and his family. Sarah returned to Chicago but called him almost daily, worried about his well-being. Their conversations were a lifeline, reminding him that despite everything, he still had a family who loved him. Eleanor respected his need for space, communicating primarily through email about practical matters, bills, the house, appointments with the mediator they'd agreed to see, instead of immediately filing for divorce. Thomas was grateful for her restraint, even as part of him ached for the comfortable companionship they'd once shared. One evening, about a month after moving out, Thomas ran into Robert at a downtown restaurant. He was dining alone when he spotted the man entering with a group of colleagues. Thomas recognized him immediately from the photos, and from that day at the hotel. For a moment, Thomas considered leaving to avoid a confrontation. But something in him rebelled at the thought of being the one to retreat. This man had taken enough from him already. The fake imitation. Robert noticed him as the group was being seated, his confident expression faltering as recognition dawned. After a brief word to his companions, he approached Thomas's table. "Mr. Harrington," he said, his voice low, "I don't know if we should be talking, but I wanted to say I'm sorry for the pain I've caused." Thomas looked up at him, this stranger who had become so intimately entwined with his life. Up close, Robert looked younger than in the photos, and distinctly uncomfortable. "Are you?" Thomas asked evenly. "Sorry, I mean. Or are you just sorry you got caught?" Robert shifted his weight. "I genuinely care for Eleanor," he said, as if that explained everything. "It wasn't just some casual fling." "That's supposed to make me feel better?" Thomas asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "That my wife developed real feelings for you while lying to my face for months?" "No, I suppose not," Robert admitted. "Look, Eleanor ended things completely. She made it clear her priority is trying to save her marriage. I respect that." "How noble of you," Thomas said sarcastically. "Tell me something, Robert. Did she ever mention that we've been together since college? That we raised 2 children together? That before you came along, I thought we were happy?" Robert had the grace to look ashamed. "She talked about you," he said quietly. "She always said you were a good man, a good father. Just not good enough to be faithful to," Thomas finished for him. "I think we're done here. Enjoy your dinner." Robert hesitated, then nodded, and returned to his group. Thomas paid his bill and left, his appetite gone. Outside, the cool evening air helped clear his head. The encounter had been unpleasant, but oddly cathartic. Seeing Robert as a real person, nervous, apologetic, ordinary, had demystified him somewhat. He wasn't some irresistible force that had swept Eleanor away. He was just a man who had wanted something that wasn't his to take. The next day, Thomas received an email from Eleanor asking if they could meet to talk. Not about practical matters this time, but about them, about the future. After some consideration, Thomas agreed. They met at a neutral location, a quiet cafe halfway between his apartment and their house. Eleanor was already there when he arrived, nursing a cup of tea, her expression anxious but hopeful. Thomas nodded, ordering a coffee from the waitress before turning his attention to his wife. "You wanted to talk," he prompted. Eleanor took a deep breath. "I've been seeing a therapist," she began, "trying to understand why I did what I did. It's not an excuse, but I thought you deserved some kind of explanation. When I turned 55, something changed in me," Eleanor said slowly. "I started looking back at my life, at the choices I'd made. I love our children, our home, the life we built. But I started wondering about the roads not taken. The academic career I put on hold to raise our family. The places I never traveled to. The experiences I never had." She paused, gathering her thoughts. Robert represented something I thought I'd missed. Intellectual passion, novelty, risk. He made me feel like the young woman I was before I became defined by my roles as wife and mother. "I never defined you that way," Thomas objected. "I always supported your teaching, your writing, everything you wanted to do." "I know," Eleanor acknowledged. "The limitation wasn't you, Tom. It was me. My own fear of stepping out of the comfortable roles I'd created. Robert was a way of rebelling against that fear, of proving I could still be daring, still be desired from my mind as much as anything else." Thomas considered her words. "So you risked everything we built together because you were having some kind of identity crisis?" Eleanor winced. "When you put it that way, it sounds so selfish." And it was selfish. Incredibly, unforgivably selfish. I can see that now. "What do you want from me, Ellie?" Thomas asked tiredly. "Absolution? Understanding? I'm still trying to figure out if I can ever trust you again." "I want a chance," Eleanor said simply. "A chance to show you that the woman you married, the woman who loves you more than anyone else in this world, is still here. That she made a terrible mistake but is committed to spending the rest of her life making it up to you, if you'll let her." Thomas felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Part of him wanted to believe her, wanted to find a way back to the life they'd shared. But another part, the wounded part, recoiled from the vulnerability that would require. "I don't know if I can do that," he admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I see you with him. Every time I think about our marriage, I wonder what else was a lie." "None of it was a lie," Eleanor insisted, reaching across the table to touch his hand. This time, he didn't pull away. "What we built together, the love we shared, the family we created, that was all real. My mistake doesn't erase 32 years of truth, Tom." Thomas looked at her hand on his, the familiar wedding band still in place. "I need more time," he said finally. "I'm not ready to come home, not ready to try again. But I'm not filing for divorce either, not yet." Eleanor nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "That's more than I deserve," she whispered. "Thank you." As Thomas left the cafe, he felt something shift inside him. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the first tentative step toward it. The possibility that there might be a way forward, even through this darkest of valleys. Winter settled over Portland, bringing with it shorter days and long, cold nights. Thomas found a certain peace in the solitude of his apartment, in the simple routines he established for himself. He cooked meals he enjoyed, read books he'd been meaning to get to for years, reconnected with old friends he'd lost touch with during the busy years of raising children and building a career. Eleanor continued to reach out in small, respectful ways. She sent him articles she thought would interest him, updates about mutual friends, occasional photos of their grandchild. She never pushed for more than he was ready to give. And Thomas found himself gradually looking forward to these points of connection. Their children adjusted to the new reality, with varying degrees of acceptance. Michael remained coolly polite to his mother, protective of his father in a way that both touched and concerned Thomas. Sarah, after the initial shock, seemed determined to maintain relationships with both parents, refusing to take sides. "She's still Mom," Sarah told Thomas during one of their phone calls. "What she did was wrong, but it doesn't erase all the good she's done. all the ways she's loved us. As Christmas approached, the question of how to handle the holiday loomed large. Traditionally, the entire family gathered at Thomas and Eleanor's home for several days of celebration. This year, everything was different. After much discussion, they agreed to have Christmas Eve dinner at Michael's house, with everyone present. It would be the first time the entire family had been together since the revelation of the affair. The evening was awkward at first, with conversation stilted and everyone hyper-aware of the tension between Thomas and Eleanor. But gradually, aided by Michael's daughter's excitement about Santa's impending visit and the familiar rituals of gift-giving and shared memories, the atmosphere warmed. Thomas found himself watching Eleanor across the room, noting the way she laughed at something Sarah said, the gentle way she helped their granddaughter unwrap a present. This was the woman he'd loved for most of his life, the mother of his children, his partner through decades of joy and hardship. The anger that had sustained him these past months felt heavier now, harder to carry. Later, as they were preparing to leave, Eleanor approached him in the hallway. "Thank you for tonight," she said softly, "for being willing to be in the same room with me, for giving our family this holiday together." Thomas nodded, suddenly finding it difficult to speak. "It was good," he managed finally, "for the kids, for all of us, I think." Eleanor hesitated, then reached into her purse and pulled out a small, wrapped package. "I got you something," she said. "It's not much, but Merry Christmas, Tom." Thomas accepted the gift, surprised. "I didn't get you anything," he admitted. At home in his apartment, Thomas unwrapped the gift. Inside was a leather-bound journal, simple and elegant. A note from Eleanor was tucked inside the cover. "I remember how you used to write when we were young. Poems, observations, dreams for our future. Somewhere along the way, you stopped. I hope you'll find your voice again, whether it's to express your anger, your grief, or eventually, perhaps, your joy." Thomas ran his fingers over the smooth leather, unexpectedly moved by the thoughtfulness of the gift. That night, he wrote his first entry, not poetry, but an honest accounting of his pain, his confusion, and the glimmer of hope he couldn't quite extinguish. In January, Thomas agreed to begin couples counseling with Eleanor. Their first session was difficult, with old wounds reopened and raw emotions exposed, but there was something cathartic about speaking these truths aloud in the presence of a neutral third party. "I need to understand why," Thomas said during one session. "Not just the midlife crisis explanation, but why you couldn't talk to me about what you were feeling. We used to tell each other everything." Eleanor considered this carefully. "I think I was afraid," she admitted, "afraid you wouldn't understand, that you'd dismiss my feelings as silly or trivial, and then afraid of losing what we had if I acknowledged my restlessness." "So instead, you risk losing everything by having an affair?" Thomas asked incredulously. "It wasn't rational," Eleanor acknowledged. "I compartmentalized, convinced myself that what you didn't know wouldn't hurt you, that I could have this adventure and then return to our life unchanged. But you were changed," Thomas pointed out. "I felt it even before I knew about the affair. You were distant, critical. Our life together wasn't enough anymore." "It wasn't that it wasn't enough," Eleanor insisted. "It was that I wasn't enough. I didn't feel worthy of the life we'd built, of your love. The affair was a form of self-sabotage as much as anything else." The therapist guided them through these difficult conversations week after week. Slowly, painfully, they began to rebuild a foundation of honesty between them. Not the same as before. That innocence was lost forever, but something new, something tempered by fire. In March, Thomas agreed to have dinner at their house, the first time he'd been there for anything other than picking up mail or discussing practical matters. Eleanor cooked his favorite meal, but was careful not to make the evening feel like a romantic overture. They talked about their children, their work, books they'd read recently, neutral topics that felt safe. As Thomas was leaving, Eleanor walked him to the door. "This was nice," she said, "having you here again." "Different is what we have now," Eleanor said gently. "I'm not trying to get back what we had, Tom. I know that's gone. I'm hoping we can build something new, something honest." Thomas looked at her, this woman he'd known for most of his life, now both familiar and strange to him. "I'm trying," he said simply. Spring brought new energy and new possibilities. Thomas found himself looking forward rather than backward more often. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it had changed, become less acute, more of a dull ache that flared occasionally rather than a constant agony. One Saturday in April, Thomas was working in the community garden he'd joined. Another new addition to his life when he received a text from Eleanor. When he arrived at the house, he found Eleanor in rubber boots, attempting to sweep water toward the drain. The sight was so familiar, Eleanor tackling household disasters with determined efficiency, that he felt a sudden, unexpected surge of affection. "Again," Eleanor sighed. "I should have had it replaced after the last time." They worked together for hours, falling into the easy rhythm of partnership they developed over decades. When the immediate crisis was contained, they sat on the back porch with glasses of iced tea, exhausted but satisfied. "Thank you for coming," Eleanor said. "I could have called a service, but it's still my house too," Thomas finished for her. "At least legally." Eleanor nodded, looking out at the garden they'd planted together years ago, now showing the first signs of spring growth. "Do you think you'll ever want to come back?" she asked, the question hanging between them. Thomas considered this carefully. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "Some days I think it might be possible. Other days, the hurt still feels too fresh." "I understand," Eleanor said quietly. "I just want you to know that there's always a place for you here, whatever that looks like." As Thomas drove back to his apartment, he realized something had shifted within him. The anger that had been his constant companion these past months had receded, making room for other emotions: nostalgia, tenderness, even the possibility of forgiveness. "Today I remembered what it feels like to be a team with Ellie. Not husband and wife, not yet, maybe not ever again in the same way, but partners in a shared life, facing challenges together. There's comfort in that familiarity, even amidst all that's changed. I'm not ready to come home, but for the first time, I can imagine a future where that might be possible." Summer arrived with its long, golden evenings and sense of possibility. Thomas had settled into his new life. The apartment now felt like home, his routines comfortable rather than merely functional. He'd started dating occasionally, casual dinners with women he met through friends or work. None of these connections deepened into anything significant, but they helped him remember that he was still capable of enjoying female companionship, still able to engage in the dance of getting to know someone new. Eleanor, he knew from their regular conversations, had not dated at all since ending things with Robert. She'd thrown herself into her teaching, taken up painting, spent more time with their granddaughter. When Thomas mentioned his own tentative steps back into the dating world, she'd been supportive, if a little sad. In July, Sarah announced she was engaged to her longtime boyfriend. The wedding would be in Portland the following summer, and she wanted both her parents involved in the planning and the ceremony. "I know things are complicated between you two," she told them during a video call, "but you're still my parents, and I want you both there, supporting me." "Absolutely," Thomas agreed. "Your day won't be affected by our situation." After the call ended, Thomas found himself thinking about what it would mean to stand beside Eleanor at their daughter's wedding. To present a united front as parents while their own relationship remained in limbo. The thought was both uncomfortable and strangely appealing. "Michael and Jenny are taking Lily camping this weekend, and I've been asked to dog sit. Thought you might like to join me for a barbecue on Saturday. Duke misses you." Duke was Michael's golden retriever, a dog Thomas had helped select as a puppy and had a special bond with. The invitation was casual, non-threatening, and Thomas found himself accepting without hesitation. Saturday was perfect. Warm but not hot, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of Eleanor's roses from the garden. Thomas arrived with a bottle of wine and a bag of Duke's favorite treats. The dog greeted him ecstatically, nearly knocking him over in his enthusiasm. "He definitely remembers you," Eleanor laughed, watching the reunion from the patio. The evening was surprisingly easy. They grilled steaks, talked about Sarah's wedding plans, reminisced about their own wedding day all those years ago. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the familiar backyard, Thomas felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. "I've missed this," Eleanor said softly, gesturing to the space between them. "Just being together, talking, no agenda, no therapy session, just us." Thomas nodded, realizing he'd missed it too. "It's different now," he observed. "We're different." "Is that entirely bad?" Eleanor asked. "The people we were, they made mistakes. Big ones in my case. Maybe the people we're becoming can do better." Thomas considered this. "Maybe," he agreed. "I know I've changed." This past year has forced me to look at myself, at what I want, in ways I never had to before. I want peace, he said after a moment. I want to feel whole again. For a long time I thought that meant leaving everything behind. You, our history, this house. Starting completely fresh. But lately, I'm not so sure. Eleanor nodded, not pushing for more. They sat in comfortable silence. As darkness fell, Duke stretched out between their chairs, content to have both his favorite humans together again. When Thomas left that night, he impulsively hugged Eleanor goodbye, the first real physical contact they'd had in months. She felt both familiar and new in his arms, and he found himself lingering in the embrace longer than he'd intended. Anytime, Eleanor replied, her eyes bright with unshed tears. This is still your home too, Tom, whenever you're ready. The next morning, Thomas woke early and went for a run, his mind clearer than it had been in months. As he showered afterward, a decision crystallized within him. He wasn't ready to move back home, wasn't ready to fully reconcile. But he was ready to try dating his wife again, to see if they could build something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed. He called Eleanor and suggested dinner the following weekend, not at the house, but at a restaurant downtown they'd always enjoyed. A proper date, with no talk of the past, no discussion of practical matters, just two people getting to know each other again. The date was both strange and wonderful. They dressed up, met at the restaurant, rather than arriving together. Thomas found himself noticing things about Eleanor he'd taken for granted for years. The graceful way she used her hands when she spoke, the particular timbre of her laugh, the intelligence that animated her features when she discussed a book she'd recently read. You look beautiful tonight, he told her, realizing he hadn't complimented her this way in a very long time, even before the affair. They talked about everything except their marriage. Current events, films they'd seen, Thomas's newfound interest in gardening, Eleanor's painting class. It was like getting to know a familiar stranger, someone both known and unknown. Tom said so. At the end of the evening, Thomas walked Eleanor to her car. There was a moment of awkwardness, neither sure how to end the night. So did I, Thomas replied. Then, following an impulse he didn't fully understand, he leaned in and kissed her gently on the lips. A brief, chaste kiss, but one that held the promise of more. Eleanor looked surprised but pleased. Does this mean you'd like to do it again? She asked. I think it does, Thomas answered, surprising himself with how right it felt. Over the next few months, they continued dating dinners, movies, walks along the riverfront. They established new boundaries, new ways of being together that acknowledged both their history and their current reality. They talked more openly than they had in years, about their hopes, their fears, their regrets. In therapy, they addressed the deeper issues that had contributed to the breakdown of their marriage. Not just Eleanor's affair, but the complacency they'd both fallen into, the ways they'd stopped seeing each other as individuals with evolving needs and desires. I took you for granted, Thomas admitted during one session. I assumed you were happy because I was happy, because our life seemed good on the surface. I stopped asking, stopped really listening, and I stopped talking, Eleanor acknowledged. Instead of telling you I was feeling restless, unfulfilled in some ways, I pretended everything was fine. And then I looked outside our marriage for what I should have sought within it, or at least been honest about needing. By the time Sarah's wedding approached the following summer, Thomas and Eleanor had established a new relationship. Not the same as before, but in many ways deeper, more honest, more intentional. Thomas still maintained his apartment, still valued his independence, but he spent more and more nights at the house, gradually reclaiming it as a shared space. The wedding was beautiful, a celebration not just of Sarah and her new husband's love, but of family in all its complex, imperfect glory. Thomas and Eleanor walked their daughter down the aisle together, stood side by side during the ceremony, danced together at the reception. They look happy, Michael observed, watching his parents from across the room. Happier than they've been in a long time. They are, Sarah agreed. Different, but happy. I think they had to break apart to find each other again. Later that night, as Thomas and Eleanor swayed together on the dance floor, he held her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume. Eleanor nodded against his shoulder. Every moment. I was so nervous, so young, but so certain about you. I was certain about you too, Thomas said. And despite everything, Ellie, I still am. Different now, wiser maybe, more cautious, but certain nonetheless. Eleanor pulled back slightly to look at him, her eyes questioning. What are you saying, Tom? I'm saying I'm ready to come home, he answered simply. Not to pick up where we left off, because that life is gone, but to build something new together, something stronger, because it's been tested, because we've both chosen it with our eyes wide open. Tears filled Eleanor's eyes. Are you sure? I don't want you to rush this decision. Thomas smiled, touching her cheek gently. It's been over a year, Ellie. I think we're past the rushing stage. I know what I want now. I want you, I want us, whatever shape that takes going forward. The kiss they shared then was different from any they'd exchanged before. Tender, but passionate, familiar, but new, carrying within it both the weight of their past and the promise of their future. 2 years later, Thomas and Eleanor celebrated their 35th wedding anniversary with a small gathering in their backyard. Their children and their families, close friends who had supported them through the darkest period of their marriage, new friends they'd made since. Their life together was different now. They communicated more openly, took less for granted, made time for both shared activities and individual pursuits. The affair was not forgotten. Such wounds never completely heal, but it had been integrated into their shared history, a painful chapter that had ultimately led to growth. If you had told me 3 years ago that we'd be here today, like this, I wouldn't have believed it, Thomas told Eleanor as they stood together watching their granddaughter play with Michael's new baby. Neither would I, Eleanor admitted. I thought I'd destroyed everything good in my life. I'll never stop being grateful that you found a way to forgive me, to give us another chance. It wasn't just about forgiveness, Thomas reflected. It was about choosing to see a future together that could be different but still worthwhile, still filled with love. As the evening wound down and their guests departed, Thomas and Eleanor sat together on the porch swing, a habit they developed in this new phase of their marriage, taking time at the end of each day to connect, to share, to simply be together. Thomas considered the question seriously. About staying? No. About the journey that got us here? Many. But I've learned that regret is only useful if it teaches you something. And we've both learned a lot. Thomas squeezed her hand, feeling the familiar weight of her wedding ring. Not the original one, but a new one they'd chosen together on their 33rd anniversary, a symbol of their renewed commitment. I love you, Ellie, he said simply. Not despite everything we've been through, but because of it. Because we chose each other again, with our eyes wide open. As darkness settled around them, Thomas reflected on the strange, painful, ultimately redemptive path that had led them here. The betrayal had nearly destroyed them, had forced them to confront truths about themselves and their marriage they might otherwise have never acknowledged. But from those ashes, something new had emerged, a relationship built on deeper understanding, greater honesty, and a love that had been tested and proven resilient. Not perfect, not unmarked by the scars of the past, but real. And in the end, that reality, hard-won, clear-eyed, chosen deliberately, was worth more than any illusion of perfection could ever be.